Hello, I'm Guy Jones, and I'm the founder and manager of Fog Arts, which is a digital jazz label based in Stockholm, Sweden. Welcome to this, the third of a series of podcasts in which I talk to jazz industry figures whose work I like and admire. My interviewee in this case is Martin Hummel, who's the founder and CEO of Bunty Music. Ubuntu is a London-based record label, artist management and consulting group that Martin set up in 2014 after a 40-year career in advertising and marketing. Martin was born and brought up in Montclair, New Jersey, was educated both in London and at Cornell University in the US, and moved to live permanently in London back in 1989. Although Ubuntu has only been going for a few years, it's quickly established a reputation for the originality of its artists and releases, and, as you'll hear, for the rather different way the label works with musicians. Ubuntu is averaging around 12 album releases a year, and its artist roster is growing rapidly. It includes musicians like pianist Andrew McCormack, saxophonists Camilla George, Eric Alexander, Martin Speake and Leo Richardson, pianist and composer Pete Lee, and guitarist Nick Costley-White. Martin talked to me about his work with these and Ubuntu's other musicians, the label's rather unusual outsourced business model, the challenges of running a record label and being an artist in the digital era, and, among many other things, the importance of individual artist branding, something that's a direct product of Martin's long former career in marketing. I started our discussion by asking Martin to explain how and why he created Bunty.
Sure. I've always had a love and an affinity for music from the time I was 3-odd years old, believe it or not. And I always had some element of involvement of music, whether I was playing, certainly always listening, putting on shows, working in professional radio, and having a real affinity for artists and their development. But after the better part of nearly 40 years in advertising, marketing, and communications, it's a young person's business. And I was the old guy in the room, even though I was a senior management individual. I guess you kind of have to know, like Muhammad Ali tried to do himself, that sooner or later you need to draw the line or you're going to end up on the floor rather than at the top of your game. Yeah. And I realized that was happening in my life and my career, so I left the big corporate part of it. And I started my own agency, again, with a different model. Having been in it for so long, you learn a lot, you know what works, and you certainly are aware of the things that don't work. And I began a startup agency with a creative partner, a very, very talented individual. His name is Tony McCheer. Tony's won the Grand Prix at Cannes at the Advertising Festival, I think on 3 occasions, which I think he's the only creative individual who has done so. And we started our own agency on a different business model in the middle of the recession and realized that was not a good time to start your own business. Yeah. We did great work and had clients who were running for the hills, not looking to invest, but cut marketing and communications budgets anywhere they humanly possibly could. So Tony and I looked at each other and said, yeah, this gig is over. And Tony went on to become the international creative director for Apple Computer. So he is the man whose work you see running all over the world, believe it or not. So it gives you an idea of the talent or caliber of the individual. And I was trying to really sort out what was going to be my next move. I wanted to do something that was near and dear to my heart. I wanted to do something where I could give back to others the way so many had given to me over my time in my career. And it was, interestingly, it was a show at Pizza Express on Dean Street here in London. It was Dave O'Higgins and Eric Alexander, 2 tenor sax players who were performing that evening. I convinced my dear wife to accompany me. She's not much of a jazz fan, but she likes their kind of music. And we went over to see the show, and that evening, depping for Jason Rebello on piano, as I recall, was a guy named Andrew McCormack. Yeah. And it was a great show, a lot of fun. I would always give Eric Alexander my pearls of wisdom, which were seldom accepted, in an embraced fashion. And that evening, I was talking to him about his website because I'll over-egg it a little bit here, but here's Eric, who who tours 200 plus days a year all over the world. He plays with all of the best in the business. Yeah. He's straight ahead bebop, hard bop kind of style. And he had this website where on the tour page, there's not a single tour date listed, and yet the guy's doing 200 plus days a year. He had images of his album, or albums. He's got 75 plus albums he's been a part of in his brief career. And none of the links from the albums would work to go and to be able to buy the album. So another dysfunctional element of his website. And then you got into things like he gives Skype lessons all over the world to aspiring saxophonists. Except that his Skype account had expired, so he couldn't give Skype lessons. So, you look at this situation, and, it was beyond a proverbial dog's dinner. And I was certainly giving him my 2 cents worth on that one. And we went off from the show to close the pub across the street, and then went up to Ronnie Scott's for the Late Late Hang, which is a period where for the second set, artists who are finishing playing from around town or happen to be in town come and jam. And Eric, who loves to play 24/7, wanted to end the evening there. So we're over there, and I'm finishing my pointed conversation with him, thanks to a few adult refreshments, which kind of lubricated the conversation a bit. And he looked at me with a half smile and a wink in his eye and said, well, if you're so effing smart, why don't you manage me? And my wife sitting next to me heard this. And Andrew, who was sitting next to my wife, heard this. And I think for the first time in my life, I was at a loss for words, which is impossible for me to be. And my wife turns to me and goes, hey, isn't that what you've always wanted to do? And I went, yeah, but I can't start with a guy like him. This guy is known throughout the world, and I've never managed an artist before. So the long story made short is Andrew, who heard the whole conversation, turned to me and said, well, hey, if you're not going to do that for Eric, would you like to help me? And I smiled and said, yeah, in the sobering light of day over a very strong cup of black coffee, we can have a conversation like that. And that began, if you will, the journey to ultimately create a holding company, which is a combination of consulting, talent management, and also recorded music.
Yes. And what year was that, Martin? Can you remember?
That was 2014, give or take.
Okay, so about 4 years ago.
4 or 5 years ago, to be fair, yeah.
Okay, and the talent management is, I guess, management, recording, we know what that is. What's the consulting side of it, Martin?
Right. Well, as I was exiting gracefully out of the corporate advertising world and winding down my small agency I started, I was getting calls and approaches from a number of different individuals, ex-clients I had worked with, fledgling agencies in the communications world, and I would often get asked to help them if I could in some capacity, either as a troubleshooter. In one case, I came in as a chairman of 3 agencies, London-based agencies, in different communications disciplines to oversee essentially 300 plus people. And I'd come in as a hired gun, but a hired gun with compassion, unlike a lot of other consultants who are reasonably ruthless, if the truth be told. I had compassion for the business. I had passion for great creativity, and I was therefore, I guess, somewhat desired by agencies that needed a bit of help.
Okay, I see. Right. So it wasn't. It isn't necessarily consulting within the music industry. It's more.
It includes the music industry, and that I can't go into detail on these, but I do work with a number of prominent jazz venues on various subjects or issues.
Okay. And, right. All right. So, but I think for the purposes of this discussion, let's talk primarily about the record label and the artist management side. Can I just ask you to explain where the name Ubuntu comes from? I know where it comes from, but I'm interested in your description.
Let's start with where is Ubuntu from, and what does it mean? The essence of the.
And what were your objectives in setting up Ubuntu? How did you want to do things differently?
Sure.
What did you want to change? Those sorts of issues.
Fair question. First, Ubuntu. Ubuntu is an African word from the cradle of civilization. The essence of its meaning is I am because we are. Now, without getting too ethereal in this thing, it essentially means that in some way, shape, or form, we're all connected in life. And anything that one person does will have an effect on others, directly or indirectly. And I deeply believe that. And the way I was introduced to it, I think, is somewhat of an interesting subject. I was running a group of agencies out of Johannesburg across South Africa and tangentially East-West Africa. The long story made short is, in the new South Africa, it is absolutely essential to have Black South African partners who are equity owners in businesses.
Yeah.
The multinationals historically didn't choose to do business that way, and in the new South Africa, it has changed, I believe, for the good, very much so. And we sought an appropriate partner for the agency group we owned. And a gentleman in particular came to our attention and became a significant equity owner. In South Africa, you've got, I think, the two most recognizable names are Mandela, as in Nelson Mandela or Mandela, is Sisulu, which outside of South Africa is much less well known. And Walter Sisulu were essentially partners in helping to break down and destroy apartheid in that country. They both served prison sentences together on Robben Island for 27 years. And when they came out, they reinvented the new African National Congress in South Africa. And Nelson Mandela was the brilliant orator. I mean, he could speak and move people like virtually no one I had ever come across. The strategist and the visionary behind much of Nelson Mandela's orators was, believe it or not, this gentleman named Walter Sisulu. Now, Walter Sisulu's first son is a gentleman named Zwolaki. Great name. Try saying that.
Yeah.
Zwolaki. It took me 6 months to get that out of my mouth properly. And Zwolaki became our significant equity business partner.
Okay, yeah.
It came from such a pedigree and history. It was exceedingly humbling for me. But after the deal was agreed and we'd signed the documents, Zwolaki took me out for lunch. And he said, I'm absolutely delighted this has happened. You have now an opportunity to grow and develop great, creative Black South African talent. And he said, but I need to share something with you, which will be very important in how well you do. And that is Ubuntu. And I was all ears and I was listening. The shorthanded version of this is, if you had an hour to have a business meeting where you needed to reach a conclusion or an agreement on a deal, the Americans would generally come in there, throw the document on the table, say, this is it, it's non-negotiable, take it or leave it, the clock is on, I need your answer now. Heck of a way to say, hi, how you doing? In South African culture, relative to the practice or application of Ubuntu, you'll spend the first 45 or 50 minutes of that meeting getting to know each other as human beings. So it's, hey, where are you from? Do you have a family? What are the important things to you in your life? What's important to you in terms of our reaching an agreement of sorts which will benefit both parties? And you get into that conversation so that by the time you've established, if you will, the foundations or platforms of who each of the two parties are and what they're all about, you can get the business deal done in 10 minutes, no problem, no issue, because you have now reached that level of understanding.
Yeah.
And it's so simple, so basic, but at the same time so profound. I said to myself, if I ever start my own business, the name of that business will be Ubuntu.
Okay. And I mean, given that these are principles you admire and presumably would like to emulate, How does the philosophy behind Ubuntu, or what that actually means in its original form, how does that manifest itself in what you were trying to do with the record label? You know,
Sure.
in what way were you trying to be different or unusual?
Yeah, I would say in a number of different ways. I've had experience before I started this stuff in negotiating record deals for a handful of artists, either extending deals, terminating deals, breaking deals, etc. And I had a fairly good sense or understanding for the structure and the composition of those agreements. And I always felt that in one way or another, first, generally speaking, in the recorded music business, it has a negative reputation overall, and mostly for good reason.
Yeah.
And secondly, I believe the record labels I have come across and worked with in some capacity always see it from the label's perspective rather than the artist's perspective.
Yeah.
And the first thing I said to myself was, if I ever start something like that, I'm going to be looking through the telescope at the end where the artist looks through it rather than the label. And in doing so, it opens up Pandora's box in terms of how you conduct yourself, your approach, the support or infrastructure you provide, the economics of it, everything. And so for me, in approaching it that way, I always see it as something that benefits the artist first, and then the label, if it does its job properly, should benefit from it as well.
Yeah, okay.
And secondly, it's a bit of an altruistic pursuit for me in that I do this not to make money, to be either rich and or famous. If I wanted that to happen, I wouldn't be in the music business. I'll tell you that right now. But it's my way, quite frankly, of, as I said earlier, paying back others for all of the things they've done to help me. And it's my time now to do some hopefully significant things for other people as a result. And I gauge or evaluate my performance based on how my artists do. I don't take a penny out of my business. Everything I earn, which is exceedingly modest, goes right back into the business to attract and develop other artists.
Okay, right. So what are the things, Martin, that other labels do wrong that you wanted Ubuntu expressly to avoid?
Yeah, keeping it on a generic level, the first is transparency. It's one big vacuous vortex or hole that defies logic or conventional wisdom. When you look at the balance sheets that come through from record labels, and all of a sudden there are things on those balance sheets that make absolutely no sense, have nothing to do with the artist in question. There are things like making decisions on anything from the music that should be released to the look and feel of the label. Let's take ECM as a case in point. I mean, they have phenomenal artists, and for the most part, outstanding music. But you look at the visual profile of those albums or releases, and it is a very, very prescriptive template on how those album covers look. It's what Manfred Eicher has decided to do, and he's very, very in going that route for his own purposes. For my purposes, I looked at the situation and went, wait a minute. That cover is the most visible thing that people will see from the artist in question. And as a result, that cover should represent the personality of the music and the artist himself or herself. And so if you look across my releases to date, of which we're about to hit 20, it is different. And it's different for a very specific reason, and it celebrates the diversity of the music, diversity of the artist in question. Going further for a moment, using, again, ECM as a reference point, because I think it's best if we do it this way. ECM has a very distinct style, sound, ethereal, and it's great. Don't get me wrong. And it's a strategy that has served the label well. For myself, I didn't want to be pigeonholed into a very specific niche or genre. So if you look at the music that's come out to date and then what's coming up in the next year, it's a very, very diversified portfolio, and essentially so. And it also reflects the nature of the artists. My artists are male and female, unlike most jazz record labels. Yeah. They're white and black. They're straight and they're gay. They're from the UK. They're from continental Europe. They're from Brazil. They're from the United States. We celebrate the fact that we are all different and unique as human beings, but we share one thing in common, and that's our love for great music.
Yeah. Okay. Good. Well, tell me a bit more about the artists. I mean, where do you find your artists? How do you, what attracts you to individual artists, and how do you find the best way of working together? What are you offering each other?
Sure.
In collaborating, within the Ubuntu family.
Sure. Let me try to help there. I started the talent management side with Andrew as an experiment.
Yeah.
And thankfully, the experiment seemed to bear fruit for Andrew in particular, and also for me. Andrew's partner happens to be a very talented vocalist by the name of Noémie Nuti.
Yeah.
And Noémie was seeking a record label for her debut release. And she had a really nice lineup on the album. It's funny, I said, let me help you. I negotiated a number of deals in all walks of life. And I went around representing her music to a handful of labels that I thought made sense, particularly given her sound, which is Latin / Brazilian / jazz influence. And I spent the better part of 6 months with one individual in particular who was very encouraged by her music, and had even received a draft contract from the individual to sign Noémie. And then when it was time to sign, actually the individual came back to me and said, hey, I'm sorry, but I have been advised by my board that I can no longer sign on additional artists. We have financial issues. Yeah. So 6 months had been wasted going through this process. Yeah. Again, giving you an indication of how this business can go terribly wrong. Yeah. And I finally looked to one of my creative partners and artists I was working with. His name is Quentin Collins. He's a trumpeter. And I said, Q, this can't be that difficult. Why don't we give it a punt and see if we can create something for Noémie to get her music out? And I had experience in design and creativity, and obviously the commercial side of business as well. Quentin was the curator as an artist and a musician, where he produced the album and performed on the album. And so we had a good piece of work. Ubuntu was the name that we chose to use, Ubuntu Music. And the question or issue became from there, what do we do about it? And I looked at different options for distribution purposes. And even back 5-6 years ago, distributors had not quite occupied the role of importance in this equation of food chain the way they are. But we started very modestly, and the experiment worked again. And Noémie was over the moon. She did, for a debut release in the jazz world, did phenomenally well. And Quentin and I looked at each other and said, yeah, we could probably make this thing happen. But in terms of how we progressed from there, there were a handful of things. I'm too old not to enjoy what I do. And so my operating philosophy is I will only work with talented, nice artists. I won't work with nice artists who aren't talented, and I won't work with talented artists who aren't nice, because life is simply too short. And on top of that, you spend a lot of time with these artists, so you better enjoy their company. Yeah. And so in Noémie's case, that was certainly the case, and it's continued from the first release. And going from there, Quentin and I scratched our heads. And I said, well, Q, what do we do for an encore? Well, I think we can make this work. And Quentin had recorded an album with Brandon Allen on tenor sax, with Ross Stanley on Hammond organ. Ross is probably the best Hammond organ player in the United Kingdom. And Enzo Zerilli from Italy on drums. And they had fantastic music in the can and was sitting around for, I guess, the better part of 3 years. And this is often a dilemma artists have. They get all excited about, wrote these great songs, we've got to get it recorded. They record it, and then they go, oh, now what do we do? It sits, in a desk drawer, and before you know it, they're off to the next project with the one that they've just completed sitting there doing absolutely nothing. So twisting the arms of Quentin and Brandon for QCBA, that's Quentin Collins, Brandon Allen, I convinced them that we ought to release this thing. They totally and utterly agreed eventually. And we had a great piece of music under our belt with artists that were well known, certainly in this country and in parts of the world. Well as McCormack are the backbone of the Kyle Eastwood Band. And these guys travel all over the world playing to very large audiences who greatly appreciate their music. So they had solid profiles to begin with. And from there, the floodgates began to open. And if you don't mind, you say, where do we find talent and how does it happen? Yeah. I see live shows all the time. Yeah. And, jazz is a village. It's not a continent. And so you get to know most of the players at times very, very well indeed. This one for release 3, and this is, I think, a fun story. I was at the Late Show at Ronnie Scott's. I was watching a guy named Leo Richardson, a tenor sax player, who was playing, who's my friend, and Leo introduces me to his father, Jim Richardson.
Yeah.
Jimbo, as he is known, is a character would be an understatement, to tell you the truth. He's in his latter 70s. He's lived the life very large, very big throughout his career. He's a acoustic bassist, double bassist. And he was the go-to guy for a lot of American artists who wanted to come and tour the UK or the continent. So Jimbo has a laundry list of greats he's played with, unlike anyone I know well. And in this instance, Jim was playing with Chet Baker. Now, Chet, his history is well known and documented by many, and he certainly had his issues. But Chet had been previously, in 1983, touring with Stan Getz on a cruise ship, okay? And Chet, Stan had a fundamental around, and you don't get sloppy when you play my gigs. And for Chet, that was eventually too difficult. Yeah. And so Chet lapsed back into his habit, and Stan, in a furied rage, essentially threw him off the ship. Chet didn't get paid, and so Chet couldn't support his habit and needed to do something about it. Well, he booked 6 shows at this small club in Covent Garden called the Canteen.
Yeah.
And the long story made short is Chet pulled together his rhythm section, which included Jim Richardson. And on the first show, the first evening, Chet and Jim are talking at the bar, and Jim goes, "Look, Chet, do you mind if I record this stuff?" Jim had this small Sony TCS 300 audio cassette recorder. I mean, this is a primitive instrument. It's not a professional Walkman or anything like that. Right. It's a basic audio cassette recording device. And Chet said, "Yeah, go right ahead." And so Jim does this. He puts this thing, his little recorder, on his bass cabinet, which is probably the worst place you could possibly.
The very worst place you can imagine. Yeah.
Yeah. And he recorded, essentially 6 nights worth and got a lot of very, very good material.
Yeah.
The long story made short after that was that Jim, once Chet died in 1988, I think it was, in Amsterdam, actually, Jim kind of scratched his head and said, "This music is far too great to be sitting in my shoebox underneath my bed. I really need to find a way to get this out to have people hear it." And the long story made short is that Jim tried with a number of individuals to do something about it. He was getting ripped off, promised things that would never get delivered, etc. And so for 33 years, he had this stuff sitting in this shoebox, doing nothing, going nowhere. On that night at Ronnie Scott's in 2015, Jim told a story to me. Yeah. And he said, "I'm an old guy. This is some of the greatest music I've ever been a part of. It's Chet Baker at his absolute top in terms of his performance. and it deserves to be heard by the world, but I don't know how to do it. The legal complications and protocol and red tape and everything else is far too great for me to handle. Yeah. And I love a challenge. Okay. So I started by going to the Chet Baker estate in Tulsa, Oklahoma, to say, guess what we have? I want to do this right, and I would like your permission to release it. And in the ready, fire, aim way of doing business, the Chet Baker estate legal counsel went, this isn't your music. You have no rights to it. Chet didn't give this to you to release, and you need to turn over these recordings to us, or we will take legal action against you.
Yeah.
And eventually, 6 months later, I convinced them that this was all being done for a legitimate purpose. It's an old man who wanted to see, one of his great wishes in his career come to fruition. And we released Chet Baker Live in London, Volume 1, 2 CD set in 2016, and the world got knocked sideways. Yeah. They loved it.
And you've just released Volume 2, haven't you?
Volume 2 was released this month, August 8th. Yeah, in fact, on the back of the success of Volume 1. In fact, Downbeat Magazine, which is kind of like the industry Bible in the United States and respected in most parts of the world for jazz aficionados, have their annual readers poll. And one of the voting sections is about historical release of the year. Well, the year we released Chet Baker Live in London Volume 1, it was chosen one of the top 10 greatest historical releases in the world. And that's against guys like Herbie Hancock, Miles Davis, John Coltrane, Alice Coltrane, Bill Evans, you name it. So we're in very good company.
One of the things that impresses me about both of those albums, actually, Martin, is the quality of the sound. And yet, when Jim gave you the tapes, it was a little cassette tape recorded on, as you say, this ghastly sort of Sony Walkman or what I left on top of a speaker. You gave a very good interview to, I think it was Jazz FM, about the mechanics of making this thing sound okay, because the original tape was stretched and not well looked after and all the rest of it. Tell us a little bit about that process of producing the wonderful sound that we'd actually hear if we listened to the Ubuntu remastered version.
Sure. Again, another challenge or hurdle
because it could have been utterly terrible, couldn't it? I mean, and I was listening to a reissue the other week of something where they hadn't cleaned up the original tape, and it's awful, frankly, even though the musicians are top class. It makes it very hard to listen to.
You're 100% right on that, my friend. It was a very, very interesting project, particularly the first time round, because we hadn't done anything like this before, and there were kind of like eclectic individuals out there who kind of did this as a hobby to varying degrees of success. From my vantage point, I laid down the gauntlet to say, look, our definitive reference point is I want to be able to close my eyes and listen to this music once it's been cleaned and feel as if I'm sitting in this 75-seat small club in London, packed to the rafters, and listening to one of the greatest trumpet players of all time. And so that was the audio reference that I had identified and we used as our benchmark. You really have to love this stuff and have the patience of a saint to make it good. What happens to an audio cassette tape, and also for that matter just audio tape, is over time it ever so slightly stretches. And when it stretches, of course, it distorts the sound. And then you have the added complication of the bits that comprise the sound itself are magnetic particles on the tape, which of course over time dissipate and dissolve even. So we had that problem to deal with. And then lastly, of course, it wasn't a professional piece of equipment. It was a single audio cassette recorder sitting on a bass cabinet. We didn't know if we were going to get this right, and I did say if we didn't get it right, there is no way we were going to release it. And to be fair to the Chet Baker estate, bless them, they had a very significant concern because there's a lot of material out these days with Chet and others where it was recorded by some guy with a pocket recorder, and it sounds like it was recorded with a pocket recorder. Yeah. We chose to go otherwise and said if we don't get it right, we're not going to do it. Yeah. And it's funny because as a result of that recording, people came out of the woodwork about this. All of a sudden, I was meeting people who were actually at one of those shows between March 28th and April 2nd, 1983 rather.
Yeah.
Who can remember those shows because it really was something very magical, and to them, to be able to relive what they saw live at that time gave them great satisfaction and joy, and that's what this business is all about.
Yeah, sure. But it's a remarkable achievement when you listen to it. It sounds as though you had a whole sort of digital setup there with engineers, and there was probably might. It's hard to believe that it was just Jimbo plonking his old Walkman on top of a speaker.
Yeah, exactly.
And
it was one.
Yeah, it's a terrific achievement, I think, Martin. Can I ask you about tell me a bit about some of your other artists, and to what extent they reflect your musical passions and interests. And I'm thinking, as you mentioned earlier, it's a very diverse range, isn't it? We've got, Camilla George on terrific British. Well, she's British, isn't she? Or maybe she was born in Nigeria. I can't quite know.
Yeah, her background is from Nigeria, and she is very much a London sax player today. Yeah.
Yeah.
But she was very, very influenced by her background and heritage, Caribbean heritage as well from her father.
Okay.
Camilla's a great example. I had seen her and heard her perform. Months before I actually approached her and said we could possibly do something together. She had a very strong band. Members of her band include Femi Kolioso on drums, who's a part of the Ezra Collective, which is essentially one of the biggest London new jazz wave bands you're going to find in this country. And Camilla had a lovely, lovely sound, influenced very significantly by artists like Kenny Garrett. And she was ready to do her debut album. We put it out there, and Camilla has gone from strength to strength to strength ever since. In her earlier days, she really struggled to get a decent date at a respectable jazz club in town. But she kept her head down, worked hard, continued to raise her game. And now she's a very, very sought-after artist. She's played the Barbican with Courtney Pine. She's played Cadogan Hall with Dee Dee Bridgewater. She's very, very much in demand on a number of different levels. And I was just very lucky to have met her and been able to work with her in her slightly earlier days. We have her next album coming out, and it's a killer.
Yeah, well, I love the first one, which is called "Is Sang," isn't it? And so I'm very much looking forward to the second Camilla George outing. When's that coming, Martin?
That's September 28th. Yes, "Is Sang" is the first album, which is Eket, a dialect from Nigeria, meaning journey, and the second album, which comes out September 28th, is called "The People Could Fly," and it's a very interesting background to this one. Because Camilla, when she was growing up and as a young child, would have stories read to her by either her mom or her gran. And one of them was a book called The People Could Fly, which was actually a book that was created as a result of stories that slaves would tell to their children to give them hope that the future would ultimately be a better place. And Camilla was so touched by this, she said, eventually I want to create a piece of music that reflects what I had read to me and what I embraced so much as a young child. And so it's "The People Could Fly." She's got a fabulous list of artists, including special guests. And there's a gentleman who sings on the last track named Omar Lifehook, who is a great soul and R&B man who's been around for 20 plus years. And they do a song which is a song from the last Curtis Mayfield album before he died. And it's called "Here But I'm Gone." And it basically describes the state of America at that time, 15, 20 years ago, which is plagued by drug abuse, alcoholism, and a fairly bleak perspective on the world moving forward.
Yeah. So tell me, are you the producer on this album, or
I executive produce basically everything that comes out.
Yeah.
As a producer, I'd like to pretend I have the technical proficiency to do so. I would be misleading you and me if I did, but I basically manage the mess. I basically pull together the infrastructure. With some artists, I'll give them recommendations on studios, engineers for mixing and mastering. I do the manufacturing. I co-design the artwork in most releases, and I'm responsible for releasing the album itself and ensuring a level of success.
Yeah. So at the very least they can do is put the old white guy on as the executive producer, isn't it?
Exactly. We're going to fit in somewhere.
Yeah, that's right. Tell me a little bit about Leo Richardson as well, because Leo is of course Jim Richardson's son, a tenor sax player, and I discovered Leo's album. I'm not sure if it's his debut album or not. Released.
It is.
Yeah, I discovered it through Mark Myers in New York on Mark's daily Jazzwax blog, and again I just thought this is very, very this is just terrific. It's hard bop with a new twist, and at no point does it sort of descend into parody or simply copying. It's a remarkable record, actually, and I know Mark liked it very much, otherwise he wouldn't have written about it. But that's how I came across Ubuntu. And then suddenly we're deluged with different Ubuntu artists and releases, which is how you and I made contact, of course. But it's a lot of fun that you made this record, released this record by Leo, having worked with his father on the Chet Baker tapes. Tell us a bit about that. And
sure.
Also, are you a hard bop man at heart? Is that what you are, essentially?
I think it stripped me to my core,
right.
Which is probably pretty frightening when you think about it. Yeah, I come from the birth of cool stroke bebop, hard bop school as a starting point, and then I have some very, very broad interests from there. And when I heard Leo, years ago, I heard this guy, and I just couldn't believe what I was hearing live. And Leo had never written a composition back then. This is now, I guess, 2-3 years ago. And again, in talking to Quentin Collins about what we might do, I said, this is a guy we have to find a way to work with. And to Quentin's credit, he went to Leo and said, listen, man, you're too good not to be writing your own material. Obviously pay homage to the greats throughout the jazz spectrum, but you should do something in your own voice as well. And that gave Leo the inspiration to begin composing. And prior to that, the guy was petrified. I mean, the last thing in the world he ever wanted to do is write something in his own name, and then, Lord forbid, be disliked by his fan base because it wasn't what they rose to that challenge in a massive, massive way. And you're right about Mark Myers. I got to tell you, I think Mark Myers is one of the best in our wonderful business. Yeah, he has this blog site, Jazzwax. This is now a 30-second plug, and I hope I get a 10-pound note from him as a result. But Jazzwax is, I think, the most considered one of the best written jazz blog sites I know. But like me, Mark is also he has a broad perspective on music. We're both Steely Dan maniacs. We love Steely Dan, and that was my connection originally with Mark. But I knew that Mark comes from a very strong school of hard bop and bebop. And I know that so much of what he writes tends to be from things that have been released in the past, years and years and years ago. Yeah. I approached him on this one and said, look, Mark, do me a favor. You got to hear this. If you don't like it, I respect it, and then we'll question it further. But I believe this is going to knock you sideways and backwards. He heard this thing. And like me, he absolutely couldn't believe it, because if you close your eyes and listen to that stuff, you think you're listening to Blue Note recordings from the late 50s, early 60s with the masters. It's that that good. And I have yet to come across anyone who said anything other than the highest level of praise for that album. Yeah. And it put Leo on the map in a big way. The Guardian newspaper, which is probably the best mainstream newspaper in the United Kingdom when it comes to covering jazz, gave Leo a 5-star review for his debut album, which, to their knowledge, they had never given to a debut artist in their history as a newspaper covering jazz music.
Is that John Ford? Is that John Forden?
You know what? It's a good question to ask, because you now have Dave Gelly and John Fordham, and they split their time. They're not allowed to review the same album. No. And so Dave got this one.
Okay. Right.
But John certainly knows Leo and has written very nice things about him. It was Dave Gelly's review in the Guardian and Observer.
Okay. Well, I mean, I'm looking forward to the next Leo Richardson release anyway, whenever that is. And
he's in the studio next month.
Okay, good, jolly good. So I guess we can expect that sometime next year.
Indeed.
Okay. And then there's a host of other artists, and the roster gets bigger every month, it seems. So some of the more interesting ones I've seen recently, Pete Lee has released a lovely album in, I think it was June, wasn't it?
You're absolutely right. Pete's an interesting project, because I was
not quite what I would call jazz necessarily, but or not in its traditional.
Yeah, you're right. You're absolutely right on that one, Guy. I came across Pete and his music through a mutual friend. His name is Matt Roberts. He's an excellent trumpet player in this country, and he does a lot of big band work. And he also not only composes, but he conducts. He's a music director, and he was asked to do Pete's album. Right. Pete is a pianist, jazz and classically trained. But he does, believe it or not, he tours 100+ days a year in the pop world with some very interesting people. He's touring the United States as we speak, in fact. Okay. But his heart and soul is jazz and classical roots.
Okay.
And Pete read a book years back. It's called The Velvet Rage. And it was a seminal writing for an American author in terms of giving guidance and advice to gay men in dealing with their sexuality, which 20 years ago was a pretty significant issue. And it had a profound effect on Pete, to the point where he said, I actually want to write music, to create an album that recognizes this and recognizes Pete's journey in dealing with his sexuality. And the music and the album is beautiful.
It is beautiful. It is beautiful. Yeah, it is.
Yeah, it's got its roots in classical music, in jazz. It has a string quartet to it as well, and it's beautifully crafted and composed. We launched the album, and the album launch show in London was a complete sellout and brought people literally to tears. It was a very, very, very special night.
Yeah. And then just finally, before we move on to other things, tell me about, you've got a guitarist called Nick Costley-White. I think Nick's bringing out something very soon. How did that come about, and what kind of new departure does that represent for you?
Yeah, bless Nick. He's a great guy. By the way, he's probably about 6'4", 6'5". So I strain my neck every time I meet him.
Yeah, the tall people are so annoying, aren't they, Martin?
Yeah, they are. They are. Or at least stand on your knees, and then I can deal with it.
Yeah.
With Nick, he actually approached me. Because things have gone well over the last year, increasingly more and more artists approach me about representing them. They thankfully hear some good things about what we do and how we do it, and they like the artists that we have on our roster. And so Nick wrote, almost in a blind capacity, a note to me, having done his homework, explaining his background, his music, giving me some demo tracks that he had created, etc. And I took an instant liking to his stuff. And then, as I do with every artist, I never just sit here and listen to something and go, great, let's do a deal. Back to Ubuntu now, I spend some pretty heavy-duty time with every artist prospect to get an understanding for what makes them tick, what are the important things to them about their playing and their careers, what are they really looking for in a relationship and a record label, and then only then, after I know and like them and their music, do we talk about possibly releasing something. And that happened with Nick, of course, and I got to tell you, he's got a killer lineup. He's got Dave Hamblett on drums. He's got Matt Robinson on piano. He has Connor Chaplin on bass, who's become the go-to bassist of the 20s to 30s set here in Jazzland, London. And it's beautiful stuff. It basically plays off the American songbook heritage and then consists of a series of compositions in his name and in his voice, which fit in very, very comfortably.
Yeah. Okay, good. I mean, you talked again just there, Martin, about the importance of the relationship and the wider aspects of the way you work together. I'm interested in a comment you made recently in a blog post by someone, I can't remember, Sandy something.
Jazz, yes.
Yeah, that's right. Sorry. Where you say you make clear that you see musicians as brands, and I suppose that's a reflection of your marketing past. But it's a very interesting idea, and probably sounds like heresy to some musicians. What do you really mean by that when you talk about musicians as brands?
Sure, it's a great subject, Guy, and I could go on for several days.
Well, don't you? You don't. I'm not. You can't.
I'll spare you that pain.
Yes.
But I have grown up understanding the value and also the power of a well-positioned brand and its connectivity with its target audience. And in my advertising days, one of my major clients over that 40-odd year period, was the Pepsi-Cola company. And back in 1985, just before I joined that business, they created what we refer to today as music marketing. It's basically taking a brand like Pepsi-Cola, which is nothing more than a carbonated sugared water, which has a certain profile. Its target market is a youth audience. And we created associations with prominent artists who were also attracted by that same target audience. And it began in 1985 with Michael Jackson. And that relationship between Jackson and Pepsi was an exceedingly powerful one for both parties. Because what does Pepsi bring to Michael Jackson? It brings to Jackson a landscape geographically that Michael Jackson could never tour or see for himself. And Pepsi's marketed and distributed in 75, 80 countries. They produce billions of these cans or bottles a year. You've got space on the bottle or can to put the profile of an artist or an individual. You can create, if you will, promotional opportunities between the two parties, etc. And starting with Michael Jackson and going from Michael Jackson to Tina Turner, Lionel Richie, Madonna, which is a deal I did in 1988, 89, Robbie Williams, Kylie Minogue, Pink, Beyonce, Britney Spears, you name it. I developed a set of tools which came very, very handy for what I now do in the music business of my own. But, the really clever switched-on artists fully get the fact that they are brands. I mean, if you look at Jay-Z, if you look at Beyonce, if you look at will.i.am from Black Eyed Peas, they proudly refer to themselves as brands. And there's nothing wrong or bad about the word brand. Brand means it has a personality and a defined, if you will, positioning, which is then communicated to your target audiences. But you're right. There are a lot of artists, particularly in jazz, when they hear the word brand, they think, selling out.
Yes, exactly. Yes.
Corporate, commercial. They're the ones who will never really go anywhere if I'm going to be really blunt about it. Okay. And then you look at the guys like Keith Jarrett, you look at Brad Mehldau, you look at Chick Corea, you look at any of these guys, they do have brand profiles. They have brand-defined properties. They don't talk about themselves as brands and give you their marketing speak, but they behave and they communicate as a brand that has a defined point of view.
I mean, one. If you were being cynical, you could argue that jazz musicians of that stature have a brand because they're terribly successful and they've been around a long time. They have very, very large global audiences. How does your brand concept, Martin, actually? How does it manifest itself with Ubuntu's artists who are not quite as well established?
Sure, another very good question, and it's horses for courses. It depends on the artist. I started with Andrew, as I said, and before we did anything, we spent days and days in workshops, one-on-one, for me to understand everything I could about Andrew as not only a human being, but also as an artist, and also begin to define some parameters. And the whole objective of the day to a positioning in the business for Andrew that was unique and also motivating to his potential audiences.
Yeah.
And sometimes it's obvious, sometimes it's intuitive, and sometimes you really have to dig deep to find it.
Okay, but it's your ambition that all of Ubuntu's artists should have a brand of some recognizable kind.
The answer is a qualified yes. I mean, even if artists choose to do absolutely nothing, that in and itself is a statement about that. Yeah. And as a brand, it's an undefined brand. Yeah. It goes nowhere. Yeah. So, we're all brands whether we like it or not. There's good brands and not so good brands.
Okay.
And it depends really on whether the artist is prepared to go through this process with me. But, it's when we launched big name brands around the world, we had 3 years to strategize and test and retest options, etc., and look at different cultures around the world to see what would resonate and do well most. We don't have that luxury in the music business and with jazz artists. So, you take years and you compress it into weeks, if not a month, and you take what was tens of millions of dollars just to get you to define brand positioning for a major product. And in our case, we don't have that luxury either, and we do it for free out of the love for the artist and his or her music.
Yeah. Okay. Let me ask you. When it's so comparatively easy for artists to self-produce and self-record these days, and self-issue for that matter, what does coming to a record label still bring to an artist? How will it help them or add value, or rather, what is Ubuntu's contribution to that relationship? What do you bring to the party that they couldn't get themselves? Because as we all know, it's terribly hard to find a record company in jazz nowadays, isn't it?
Yeah. You have unearthed some very, very insightful questions. My hat goes off to you. And this is a great one, a truly great one. And I'll only attempt to try to give you an answer that makes sense. In my conversations with artist prospects, I go through the laundry list of the options they have available to them. And it starts with self-releasing. Some people call it vanity publishing. The opposite end of the spectrum, which is, a major record label. Yeah. And I talk them through what each of those brings to the party in terms of helping or potentially hindering. I actively encourage artists to actually look at the self-publishing side because they ought to know what's out there and what they get or don't get as a result. And there are a number of artists who have preferred to go that route. But I'll tell you something. Just this year alone, I think 4 or 5 of my artists are previously self-published who have come to me.
Okay.
I'll give you one guy, Martin Speak, very interesting guy, alto saxophonist, very highly regarded, ex-ECM artist, ex-Edition Records artist, self-published as well over the last 7 releases he's done, and then he chooses to come to me.
Yeah, this is the album with Ethan Iverson or Iverson.
Yes, that's right. Ethan Iverson, correct.
The do the math guy, the very cerebral do the math guy. the Bad Plus. I mean, terribly famous, really, if you know anything about contemporary jazz. Yeah, and Martin Speake is a very highly respected figure, isn't he?
Yeah, so he's an exception.
Yeah, so go on. I interrupted you. Why did Martin, after years of self-releasing, why did he come to you?
I think there are a handful of things. As part of the relationship in terms of what I think I bring to the party that you don't necessarily get from other places and I've seen from other labels, is I represent the needs and the desires of the artist, first and foremost. And then I create the services and the infrastructure around those needs. And so it is bespoke. It is very, very distinct and different artist to artist to artist in terms of what we do and how we do it. There are some commonalities, of course. There's a roadmap that you have to go down, but where you choose to stop off and go and visit is different artist to artist. And I think, actually it would be good for a number of artists to start in self-publishing because they're going to learn very, very, very quickly that it ain't as easy as it seems. And I start my speech, and I get on my pulpit with, from my perspective, my humble opinion, for an artist to ever achieve his or her potential, they have to spend every waking hour doing three essential things. They have to practice, they need to compose, and ultimately they need to perform. And guess what? There's not enough time in the day to do those three things well.
Yeah.
And then on top of that, you're going to take on the responsibility of releasing your music. And you're going to do that in a vacuum without, a counterbalance or a neck to grab or a throat to choke to hold accountable or responsible to make that a success because you got no one else. You're doing it yourself. And it's a pretty lonely place when you go at it on your own. Artists are not commercially driven. Artists are not marketing driven for the most part. And that's the stuff that I bring to the party as a starting point. And I take all of that necessary evil stuff that has to happen in releasing an album, and I do it for them far better than they could ever do it themselves. That's the starting point, but I think you have to layer that for a moment.
Yeah.
And that is, in this day and age, an artist can self-publish, and they can go to a third-party independent distributor and pray their music gets somewhere. I've been really lucky. I started my first distributor relationship with a party through a friend because I couldn't even qualify for the credit to be signed up, and I had the friend to kind of override that for me. And then went from there to a strong, solid, physical-driven distributor. And now, as of the start of this year, I'm with The Orchard. The Orchard
I know
is
them, that's in New York, isn't it? I think,
Yeah, they were the first digital music distributors in the world, started in New York 20 years ago, believe it or not, when people didn't know what digital was.
Yeah.
And they've grown and developed exponentially to the point where Sony acquired them about 18, 20 months ago. And you'd say, Sony? Sony buys this digital distributor? Yeah, and that's because Sony, one of the great dinosaur music label giants, never saw the advent of digital technology and what it could do in the music business until it was far too late. And the big four have suffered immeasurably as a result. But at least Sony was smart enough to go, you know what? We got to get our act together in that sector. And they bought the best in the business, which was the Orchard.
Yeah.
So now you had Orchard and digital. You had Sony with their physical infrastructure as good as anyone. Because remember, Sony makes headphones, audio equipment, video game consoles, you name it, plus recorded music. So they had the physical side down very, very strong, but not the digital. And that's where the Orchard came in. I am now represented by the Orchard, and I feel exceedingly grateful for that because they are the best in the business. And no individual artist is going to be able to go to the Orchard, knock on their door, and say, hey, I'd like you to release my one-off album in my name. It doesn't work that way. So at the end of the day, when you cut through all of the different bits and pieces of what I try to do and make unique and distinctive to the artist, the bottom line is the relationship I have with the distributor is the best in the business. And no artist independently could ever achieve or develop that relationship on their own.
Okay, well, that's a good point. And you just mentioned digital. I'd like to ask you about the digital era we're in. And again, I think in the recent interview you gave, you talked about digital being something that's here to stay, whether we like it or not. Digital, as a guy who runs a kind of mom and pop digital reissues label, digital is something. I think it's like it's a gift from God to artists, but most artists loathe it, and because they feel like it's robbing them in some way. Can I? What's Ubuntu's position? Can you just clarify for me what your feelings are about streaming? Less so. I mean, nobody downloads. Even now, downloading is a thing of the past, isn't it? It's all streaming. Tell me what your view is, because you seem to embrace it, and I'm interested in what kind of reaction that gets from your artists and from your public. The fans of your artists.
I have to give a little bit of background on that. I do love technology, full stop, and I am a little bit of a geek as well. I said that it's reality in this business, whether you like it or not. You can fight it all you want. It's there to stay, and it is going to become the way in which you consume music. And we can talk about vinyl and all that other great stuff. And they're positive, pleasant distractions, but it has nowhere near the power and the future of digital music delivery and also consumption. I think it's a healthy thing. I think it's a very healthy thing because it levels the playing field and allows the barriers of entry to be far less severe as a result. For you to create a physical product, particularly a vinyl product, secondarily a CD product, it takes money, some real money.
Yeah.
You can cut out all of the manufacturing costs by going direct into digital, which again opens the floodgates for more artists to share their music. That to me is the starting point. And secondly, digital's had a bad rap for all of the wrong reasons, and that is, firstly, people complain or accuse digital music to be poor quality. I don't want to get technical on this.
Yeah.
And that is such a great misnomer, I can't possibly tell you. Sure, if you go onto YouTube and you listen to a track that's been uploaded in an MP3 format where the high end and the low ends have been compressed into one flat, vanilla, middle range sound, yeah, doesn't sound very good. But that's not digital's fault. That's actually the type of file that was uploaded for people to hear.
Yeah.
Digital at its highest end is better than anything you could possibly do, and far better, in my opinion, than anything you could ever put on vinyl. So it's not digital as a vehicle or channel, it's the use or abuse of digital that has given it a bad name.
Yeah.
Then you get into the other stuff being like, oh, well, there's no real payback on this.
Yeah.
The payback, let's be honest, the payback is modest at this point in time. And, I think Spotify for most, particularly artists, is a frenemy of sorts. It's a combination of friend, enemy, and enemy. In one regard, it's got a fantastic platform, and it gives people access to music that they may never hear or even consider buying. And the other side is, the fractional, should we say, pay per unit is really, really, really modest. I think it's 0.000397 the last time I looked per track or per track.
Yeah, I know. I have to go through the Excel sheets. I know exactly what it generates and what it doesn't. Yeah.
Yeah, there you go. And I just think it's just a matter of time before that migrates on into a better place and a better space. But you've got Spotify. They're heavily laden with debt, as you know.
Yeah.
They've gone with their IPO type of, if you will, offering, and it's injected capital into the business, which is good. But having said all that, they're owned by the big four record labels who are still looking to get their chunk of flesh out of this whole thing. And I think as that platform settles and as the business model improves, it can only go up, not down, in my humble opinion. The real enemy in this whole thing is not Spotify. It's not Apple Music. It's actually YouTube. And they pay the absolute very least or nothing, as the case may be in some situations, and they're looking to change that model because they know eventually that is not sustainable.
Yeah, yeah. Okay, well, I mean, there's a Ubuntu. We'll leave aside I have very strong, extremely strong feelings about this, and I think I think the amount of moaning about streaming is astonishing, coming from musicians who would otherwise be totally ignored. And I'm sick of having these, hearing these whines from extremely famous and experienced journalists as well, who should know better. But anyway. Now, having said all that, Martin, Ubuntu still produces CDs and vinyl. I mean, at some point, it needs to make a return, doesn't it, from its investment? And I know it is still possible to make money from CDs if you're smart about it. What is your view? I mean, would you rather cut the physical side out entirely and go wholly digital, or do you think there's a place for both physical and digital platforms?
I think most definitely there's a place for both. And then within the physical world, I believe that both CDs and vinyl has a role to play for the indefinite future. Taking a step back for a moment, and looking beyond the confines of the United Kingdom, because my artists are distributed worldwide and not just in a digital format. There are markets which still are very hardcore when it comes to physical product. If you look at Germany, very much of a physical market. If you look at France, very much of a physical market. If you look at Japan, which is a major market for music, mostly all physical, which almost defies conventional wisdom, because you go Japanese culture, technology, blah, 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 and they're buying CDs. Yeah. It's like, what? But that's the way it works. And so if you're going to play in those spaces, you've got to have the avenues or vehicles to meet the needs of those people. And then, of course, the United States, which is increasingly going digital, still has a buoyant physical market infrastructure. So it's important to have both. But secondly, and I think importantly in that, is when, again, you stand back and you think about it, artists, particularly jazz artists, who are clever, make a good amount of money selling their physical product at gigs. Yeah. You can often, the rule of thumb that I use from experience is that you'll get, on average, for a good artist and good music, minimum 10, maybe 20% of an audience attending a show buying something as a result of a great show itself. Yeah. That, if you will, supplements their fee or the compensation quite handsomely. And that allows for them to achieve break even and ultimately profit on the cost of having manufactured that product. And then you get into the vinyl territory, which to me is a very interesting one, because Mark Kavuma, someone we haven't talked about, who's phenomenal, young jazz trumpet player whom I released earlier and has done amazingly well. He wanted to do vinyl, and I said, you do know what this is going to cost you. This is not pennies we're talking about. He was hell-bent on it and found any and every way possible to be able to afford it. And this guy is selling vinyl as if it's the only vinyl out in the marketplace. And I think that's because of a combination of things. The type of music he's playing, the audience he appeals to, who are increasingly more and more vinyl-based in terms of the way they listen to music. Yeah. And again, the markets which are physical markets, and vinyl happens to play an important role. So they're all there to serve a purpose. Where we are in 20 years is another subject, but for the foreseeable future, yeah, digital and physical.
But I mean, do you subscribe to the commonly held view that recorded music now exists to support the live performances? It's essentially a marketing tool with which to support concerts, whereas previously it operated it was the antithesis of that, wasn't it? It operated the other way around. The money was in selling records. The concerts were tools to promote the sales of the records. Do you agree with that, or am I talking nonsense?
A good question. I'll dance around it first. One of the things I go through in some detail with the artists I work with or represent is, why do you want to release an album? And, the usual suspects or choices I tend to throw out are you doing it for ego? And, that's a legitimate reason to do it. Are you doing it to make money? And if it does make money on your album, are you doing it to make a statement at this point in time in your career as kind of like a reference or data point to say, this is where I was in the development of my voice as a musician? A combination of things. And once we tease out that, we can then have a proper conversation on how we're going to do that or how we're going to achieve those objectives. For most artists, quite frankly, they don't release their music in a recorded format to make money or with the expectation of making money. They do it, again, to make a statement about their capabilities as an artist. And they also do it because it serves as a nice reference on tour to be able to have someone bring home that magic sound that they just heard live and serve as a reminder in their living rooms and listen. Relative to the money issue now for a moment, we're smart enough with the way we do things so that we really compress our cost structures on releases. And we also think very carefully about what we manufacture or produce in terms of units. So we're not stuck with a warehouse of stuff that is collecting dust and ultimately is going to dissolve over centuries. We're pretty smart and pretty clever about it. And we also have multiple outlets for where we sell, not only through my distribution system with the Orchard, but we also use Bandtap, which I actively encourage artists to use. And it's a wonderful vehicle to kind of buy from the artist direct rather than from big giant corporation kind of thing. But it's the on-the-road stuff that they sell that I think really is the most gratifying for them and also the most lucrative in most cases.
But surely, Martin, correct me if I'm wrong, that the largest cost in making an album is actually the studio time and possibly some of the other musicians.
Yeah, okay, if you put the bits and pieces together and you strip out things like rehearsal days and studios and stuff like that for that, it's strictly limited to the actual creation itself of the product. Yeah, you have your studio sessions, and you can spend. We'll do a generic version of it. For recording in a studio, you're looking at 2 to 4 days, including overdubs and everything else, and you're probably into anywhere between 2,000 to 3,000, and that's a modest figure. You can take it up to 20,000 if you want.
Yeah.
You have to pay your artists something, at least a session fee, and/or give them a cut of sales if you so choose. You've got your mixing and mastering, which then plays a role as well. In the mixing, you're $1,000 to $2,000 there. You're also in the mastering, $1,500 to $3,000, and then you've got a product, which we call a DDP, that wonderful piece that's ready to go somewhere and do something. But just before you go into manufacturing, of course, you've got to do all of the design work. That takes time. You've got photography. You've got then a designer or an illustrator working with you, a photographer, who will take that cover shot that's going to be kind of like the beauty shot. That could cost you $1,000 plus easily. Yeah. Or you buy a piece of artwork. In the case of one of my artists, we're going to release next year. Then you go into manufacturing, and let's say you produce just 1,000 as an initial run of CDs. Keep it simple. We won't even touch vinyl right now. That's going to run you, depending upon the format of the packaging and everything else, round numbers, £1,500, including VAT, and then you're ready to release. But when I say you're ready to release, you need publicity behind it because no one's going to know it's out there unless you have a publicity campaign. Throw in another couple £1,000 for that, and that's national publicity. You're going to tour. You want people to know that you're on the road and you're going to be visiting these towns. That's another £2,000 plus. So by the time you get the whole package crafted or sorted, minimum 10,000,
yes,
15,000.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. But it seems to me that, if I think of the sort of I hate to use the adjective, but if I say struggling musicians out there, the ones that I meet, They can't even afford to make the recording, never mind producing a CD or, I mean, crikey, a professional publicity campaign is in their dreams, with something they could never possibly do. And if they manage to fund a recording at a few £1,000s or euros or whatever it is, if it gets publicised at all, it's only through their own endeavours rather than paying someone to do it. And it really grinds them down, of course, and that's what makes them cynical about digital. It makes them depressed. It makes them wonder whether they're doing the right thing. It's a sort of horrible downward spiral that gets to people. And I assume you see the same thing time and time again, don't you?
No question, no issue, and that's particularly true for the young artists who are coming out of music college. They haven't established themselves, and they all want to record their first album yesterday.
Yeah.
And that is a big issue. And there are a number of options we have, but they're limited options. And that is, in this country, the United Kingdom, there are, should we say, vehicles that can, in fact, subsidize costs for recording, for releasing, for touring. The fortunate artists who can gain, if you will, that funding are free and easy, and it becomes so much more in their advantage. For those who aren't fortunate to be the recipients of funding, then you got to really, really struggle and squeeze every penny. I run my business model whereby the old days of recorded music, record labels threw money at artists. And artists never had to put a penny into it. Those days are long gone, and particularly in the world of jazz. And even the majors aren't putting money into, funding the costs of artists to release music. Or if they do, it's on a very, very modest level that only scratches the surface. But my model, I don't put in money or invest money. I offer competitive rates that are as good, if not better, than anything else out there. And they get my time and my attention, which is essentially, for the most part, for free, which has a value and a cost associated with it, with other people they work with. And we find a way to make their budgets work. I have a pro forma, if you will, budget plan that I go through with my artists. And we start with the dream stuff, and then we wake up to reality, and we figure out how we close the gap between the dream stuff and the reality factor. But it is tough. It is very, very tough. But although, the thing is, I'll say this to you. It's more interesting and clever ways of making this stuff happen. Mark Kavuma is a great case in point. Mark had artists to record his album from, half of them were from New York. Session guys, really, really, really talented people. And what Mark chose to do is not go into the big name studio, but something modest that would fit his needs. And he decided to make absolutely certain he was going to record the entire album in one day. Now, very few artists can manage to do that unless they're very well organized and know exactly what they want. And then you look at the rock world, or you look at a band called Guns N' Roses. It took them 10 years recording their last album before it came out. Okay? Mark did this in one day. So already he's saved thousands of pounds. And, we're in an industry which, again, is a bit of a village or a cottage industry. We've got mates. We help each other. The smart people in this business don't fight and tear each other apart. What they do is support each other. And, working with Mark and using my contacts as well, we came up with a really, really, should we say, attractive proposition. So that album costs much less than it would have for most, and yet it sounds as good as anything you're going to hear out there. So good that it's received 4+ stars ratings everywhere in the world, including the United States and Downbeat magazine.
Okay, so now I understand your business model, Martin, which I didn't quite. I thought it was a sort of traditional record company model at first, and now I understand you're more like a facilitator.
Yeah, an enabler is what I call it.
Yeah.
I help people achieve their ambitions and dreams in life and in their professional world.
Yes. And you say that if you are making any profits, it goes straight back into the business rather than...
Correct.
One assumes because you're already phenomenally rich, Martin. Is that not right?
No, phenomenally rich, no. Phenomenally lucky, yeah. Big time. I worked in the advertising business.
So you must be loaded. Yeah, I used to work in advertising as well, but I'm not loaded.
I just got really lucky. I worked very hard, and I loved what I did in advertising, and it was very kind to me. So much so that, I can afford to do what I'm doing, not for the money, but for the love. And the sales splits I take are fractional relative to others, including the smaller independents in jazz. And it's not a competitive thing. I want to see an artist's money go more directly to what they do, and I want them to be rewarded financially more quickly. I'll give you an example, Guy, because it's an important
but
one.
by the way, I was only pulling your leg, Martin. I certainly didn't mean to be impertinent. No. I was just trying to...
I'll give you an examp. No names.
I'm glad you're not making any money, because we're not making any money either. So it would be very distressing to know that it was all paying for holidays in South America.
Exactly.
But go on, tell me your anecdote. Come on.
It's what my dad used to refer to as psychic income.
Yeah,
in other words, you can't invest it or you can't put it in a bank, but man, it feels good.
Yeah, that's right. That's right.
To give you another aspect of the model, which is so attractive to artists for a moment, and back to them making the money, not me. Normally when a record label manufactures, let's keep it simple, CDs, and then an artist wants an inventory to sell on the road or to friends or do whatever they do with them. A record label can charge an artist, round numbers, anywhere from a minimum of £5 a unit plus VAT up to £7.50, almost £8 a unit. Now, the artist then sells that on the road at a gig for £10 a unit. They make £2, maybe even £5. My model, because of the way it's structured, is that they basically pay for everything that we do, but they own their inventory. So when it comes through the sausage factory and those big boxes of CDs are ready to rock and roll, they own that inventory, and they don't pay me a penny for that inventory. So every CD they sell at £10 is a £10 note in their back pocket.
Yeah, sure.
And no one has that on offer other than me.
Yeah. I understand. Okay, good. Can I? Let me ask you a couple more questions. I mean, this has been great, and we could talk for hours. Maybe we should do another one actually. But are you've got a roster of artists, and it seems to get bigger every month or so. And I know there's a lot happening at Ubuntu over the coming months or 12 months. And you, obviously, clearly, I inferred that you're getting approached by people all the time, and sometimes you can help them, sometimes you can't. Are you actually actively targeting other labels' musicians because you like their work, or because you feel they're being not looked after properly?
No, it's a very good question, but I have a fundamental principle that I won't touch any artist that is under contract with anything. They need to be free agents first and foremost, or I'm simply not interested. It's just not worth the hassle, and it goes against the grain of what I believe in, and it also then becomes a rather aggressive environment you create as a result. I don't want to steal anyone's artists. There are too many good artists out there to have to go and steal someone else's artists. But when an artist becomes a free agent, then it's a level playing field.
Okay, and have you worked with artists with whom the relationship hasn't actually panned out as you'd hoped, and you've parted, even though Ubuntu is still a pretty young company?
Interesting question. We're still too young to have been
without naming names, of course.
Yeah. Relative to the artist roster we have, we're still probably too young to go through that pain threshold yet. But every artist I started with remains an artist of mine, and I think the ultimate accolade for me, which really makes me happy. I told you about Andrew McCormack.
Yeah.
Where I started. And he was under contract with Edition Records, which is an independent label. I used to be chairman and also shareholder of Edition Records previously. But Andrew needed his contract extended, and I negotiated that deal for him. He remained on Edition, and then I negotiated his contract for Harmonia Mundi Jazz Village, which is a wonderful label. It's got Chucho Valdez on it. It's got Ahmad Jamal on it. It's got Kyle Eastwood on it. It's a good, solid label. And we did his last release on Jazz Village. But Andrew has come to me since then and asked if I would now be his record label, which it was never my intention. It was never my objective. It was never my desire. I only put his interests first and foremost in anything I did. But for him to actually come to me saying, you know what, I've tried those other labels, but what I really want is I want to be on your label. Ultimate form of flattery, I guess.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Okay, good. Okay, well that's encouraging. And so you don't demand exclusivity from your own artists.
It's a tricky one, you know. I'm a kind of like a. You looked at the stuff that used to go on there. You looked at Miles Davis when he was on. What was it? Was it on Riverside? And he wanted to get out of his deal, and he had 4 more releases to get. Just released literally this tranche of music, working, steaming, playing, etc., before he could go on to Columbia. And I know to hold artists to ransom for that stuff, I just don't buy. And it's a very fluid market, and I think more so than the contemporary music sector, which I know a fair amount about. It's a very promiscuous one, meaning you got a lot of artists who play with different guys. And so to try to be prescriptive on an exclusivity basis is almost impossible given the nature of this kind of music. So I work with artists who got a lead, but yet his guys in the band or his session artists or his special guests are all on different labels. And I think we all kind of accept that's the way it works. The lead is the issue.
Yeah, because there's a pretty well-known German label. You know who they are. It's not ECM, and they don't operate on guys on that basis, and so that's why I ask you the question. You know, so what you get is this sort of rather incestuous setup where you can only really play with guys who are also on your label, and because it just winds up eating itself basically.
Exactly right.
And I'm sure you know who I'm talking about, Martin. And if you look at some of the stuff that's put out, you know, you do think, whose fucking idea was this? You know, because and it's because they've run out of people to play with, basically.
That's true, and it's run by a guy who came from the big.
Yeah.
It's his ego machine. I mean, if you look at all the covers are his works of art that he holds in his collection.
No, let's not go there, okay? But I mean, let's not talk about individuals. But you know what I mean. So it's very interesting that that's not Ubuntu's approach. And also, as you say, it's very hard to see how that can operate in a relatively closed world like jazz, where everybody knows and plays and geeks with each other.
Yeah, I'll take it an extra step for you, Guy, for a moment. And that is, again, in trying to define whether something has been successful or not, first and foremost, it's has the artist really achieved what we agreed we sought to achieve in an initiative or a project? But ultimately, in time, the true and utter determinant of my success in working with these wonderfully talented people is to see one of my artists on Blue Note Records. And I know that's blasphemous in the industry, and others don't think that way at all. But that's my criteria for success. I want to see these guys achieve everything they richly deserve and are potentially capable of achieving.
Okay. And let me ask you a final question, Martin. I'd love to carry on, but I'm running out of time too, and I know you're busy. What does the future hold for Ubuntu? What are your longer term objectives for the label? Are you just going to carry on like this, or is there some specific goal that you're aiming towards? And how will you know when you've reached it?
No, a very good question, Guy. And like I told you earlier, this thing started as an experiment.
Yeah.
And I didn't blow myself up. I'm still here, growing and doing very well, thankfully, touch wood. As I encourage my artists to dream, I dream too. And, I've been schooled and trained in terms of developing business plans and forecasting into the future, not just financially, but in terms of brainstorming and taking the shackles off and saying, where could we be in 5 to 10 years? And I've got some exceedingly high ambitions. Whether I achieve them is another subject altogether, but natural and logical extensions to what I already do. Things like I'd ultimately like to own and or manage a venue.
Right.
That does live music here in London, because I think, given how jazz has taken off, particularly in the last 18 months in this country, and the trajectory that it's on at the moment, there's certainly more than enough room for another good, solid venue. And I do it in different ways to the ones that I know well and love for different reasons. I want to get into a proper area of the publishing business.
Right.
I'd like to be able to offer and provide that facility in a truly professional manner, rather than, skin of teeth situation that I'm in currently. I'm looking at whether I really do scale this thing to start competing at the next level with the bigger guys and the deeper pockets. And that means, off board, it means changing your business model, etc. So I'm at that interesting debate or discussion level of, do I keep this intact the way I've got it and look for 12 to 15 releases a year and be very happy with that, or do I just blow the roof off the thing? Also, what we call the exit plan or exit strategy, which I'm sure you know from your old days, and that is, okay, am I doing this to sell it and make a bundle at some point in time, or am I doing this to develop it to the best of my ability, and then groom and develop talent to take it over and bring it to the next level, which I've been incapable of doing? I very much subscribe to the latter rather than the former, because I've never done it for the money.
No, okay.
And in terms of where we go and what we do with it, I'd love to create a vehicle of live recordings. I started with Eric Alexander and Harold Mayburn, which comes out September 8th, and I've got them touring in Europe that month, and a number of shows here in the United Kingdom.
Yeah.
That happened on a whim. With Eric, I said to him, why aren't we doing something significant together? Why am I always hounding you? And he said, well, let's do it now. And literally within 24 hours, we recorded 2 of his shows. We videotaped 2 of those same 2 shows, and I had a live recording out 9 months later.
Right.
I got another one I'm working on with Eric Alexander, Seamus Blake, and a guy named Mike Ledun, who is a phenomenal organist and piano player from New York. And we'll release that album in another 6 to 9 months' time. I think, in my opinion, and this is highly subjective, mind you, but I really think jazz music was made to be heard in a live format or environment, because it is so much relative to improvisation. And sometimes the hiccups, glitches, and warts are actually parts of what makes it such a beautiful live recording. I'm looking to capture that stuff, and I'd love to create a vehicle or series where I can do that on an ongoing basis for those artists who are brave enough, because I think it does require some bravery. You can sit in a studio and you can make it sound anything you want it to sound like, and you can change it so many times so that it doesn't even resemble the playing of the artist in question. The live performance is the real acid test. That's where there's no place to hide, and I think that's the beauty of jazz.
Okay, that's lovely. Good. Well, look, I mean, I think we should get together another time and discuss that, because there's a whole aspect of Ubuntu's activities, which is the live performance stuff, that we haven't actually talked about. And I think that would make a great subject for another interview if you're willing to submit yourself to this again. But for now, we must finish, and I want to thank you, Martin, for your candour and your jollity, and for putting up with my inane questions. And I'm looking forward to meeting you soon.
Same here, guy. Thank you so much for reaching out. I loved the opportunity to talk to you, and you not only have very, very insightful questions, challenging questions, but they also are questions that help me think, inform, and shape my thinking that much more. So it's been a healthy kind of therapeutic exercise here, and we got to do it again.
We will, and thank you for your kind comments. And in the meantime, if we have any listeners, I hope you'll join us again for the next podcast.
Thank you again. I look forward to it, guys.
Thank you, Martin. Thank you.
Yes.